Velkommen til Urix. Den 21. januar 2016 så forsvinner Giulio Regini, en italiensk student i Kairo, og få uker senere blir han funnet drept. Forsvinninger som dette har blitt nærmest hverdagskost i Egypt, etter at landets sterke mann, president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, tok makten for 6 år siden. Over 300 mennesker er drept i politiets varetekt, 60 000 er arrestert, 500 medier er lagt ned, journalister og bloggere risikerer dødsstraff. Og Vesten, de snur det blinde øyet til, ifølge kveldens dokumentar. Her er vår mann i Kairo.
إن مصر لن يبنيها أو يحميها سوى أبنائها. هذه نبوءة التاريخ. تحيا مصر، تحيا مصر، تحيا مصر.
President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi presents himself as Egypt's savior, as the only man able to impose order in his country.
There's this distinct smell of tear gas, blood and bullets.
Lui è stato torturato, probabilmente anche 8-9 giorni.
ما ينفعش مسجون سياسي يتنقل لمستشفى حتى لو بيموت.
أعتقد إنه دي أكتر لحظة معقدة وصعبة في المباحثة الصحفية.
Despite his human rights record, Western leaders have embraced Sisi as a strategic and commercial partner.
Ce n'est plus notre priorité, la démocratie. Ça n'a jamais été vraiment.
Sisi was able to say, there's this threat from ISIS, you want to defeat it, give us the tools and we'll take care of this for you.
We have a fantastic relationship with Egypt, and we appreciate what you're doing.
But is Sisi really such a good bargain for the West? In April 2018, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi secured a second term in office after winning 97% of the vote. Yet the results were hardly surprising.
There were technically 2 candidates, but the other candidate, Mustafa Musa, was in fact a Sisi supporter who had stepped into the contest at the 11th hour to prevent the embarrassment of a one-horse race.
3 men from within the military establishment had initially challenged Sisi for the presidency.
In a very short space of time, all 3 candidates were dispensed with by the Sisi regime.
Sami Anan, a retired general, was charged with breaching military regulations. Ahmed Konsowa, a little-known army colonel, was court-martialed. And Ahmed Shafiq, a former Air Force commander, withdrew from the race after being held in a luxury hotel for a month. Officially, President Sisi expressed regret that no one was willing to run against him. But the situation became increasingly embarrassing for Cairo's partners in the West.
Parts of the U.S. government were communicating to Sisi and to those around him that we were concerned about his efforts to drive out every credible opponent to his re-election. I think it may even have been addressed by Vice President Pence when he went to Cairo earlier in 2018. So that message was being conveyed.
With no real contest, the main focus for Sisi became obtaining legitimacy through a high turnout.
People were promised that they would get pilgrimage to Mecca, or they would get an improved electricity supply in their town, or they would get a new water system.
أي حد فينا كان بيقول حاجة غير إنه الناس أقبلت على الانتخابات بأعداد غفيرة وتحديدا اختارت انها تنتخب الرئيس الحالي عبد الفتاح السيسي كان بيتعرض لأنماط مختلفة من المضايقات.
خلي بالكم انه طول ما ربنا معانا حامي البلد دي، لا السيسي ولا غيره، هو ربنا.
In 2011, the revolution in Tahrir Square put an end to Hosni Mubarak's 30-year regime and raised hopes that Egypt would become the Middle East's largest democracy. But the Arab Spring was short-lived. Taking power in 2013, Sisi has since ruled the country amid allegations of human rights violations and a terrorist escalation in the Sinai that has killed more than 3,000. At the start of his new mandate, we tried to understand what is happening to a country that is a key ally for the United States and for whom Europe is the main commercial partner. Our story begins with a case that brought Egyptian reality home to Europeans. A PhD student from the University of Cambridge, Giulio Regeni, disappeared in Cairo on the 25th of January, 2016. The young Italian was found dead 9 days later in a ditch on the city's outskirts. His half-naked body bore the signs of heavy torture.
Lui è stato tenuto 8-9 giorni, torturato, probabilmente in un posto che era adatto alla tortura, dove c'erano tutti gli strumenti della tortura e dove le urla non avrebbero richiamato nessuno. Erano dei professionisti perché i suoi organi interni erano sani.
È un caso che è stato chiaro sin dall'inizio, diciamo, sulle responsabilità. Sicuramente veniva dal governo egiziano.
The day Regeni went missing, a major security operation was underway in Cairo to avoid protests to mark the 5th anniversary of the revolution. The Italian authorities suspected that Regeni had been arrested that night, but the Egyptian government denied any responsibility.
There was a whole range of lurid tales. They tried to suggest that Regeni was the victim of a car crash. Later accounts emerged in the press that Giulio Regeni was gay, even though he wasn't, and that he'd been killed by a gay lover. There were suggestions that he had been taking drugs, and this was perhaps a drug deal that had gone wrong.
Il governo italiano ha immediatamente richiamato l'ambasciatore italiano, ma il segnale non è arrivato. Non è arrivato perché gli egiziani erano assolutamente indisponibili a cercare di collaborare veramente a raggiungere la verità.
Interior Minister Magdi Abdel Ghaffar dismissed Western suspicions.
الحقيقة أمر يعني يمكن أزعجنا وأحبطنا بشكل كبير جدا أن تنسب مثل هذه الأمور لجهاز الأمن المصري اللي معروف إنه بالنزاهة والشفافية ولم ينسب إليه أمر هكذا.
6 weeks into the investigations, the Egyptians said that they had found Regeni's killers. They were allegedly part of a gang that kidnapped foreigners.
A group of 4 men were traveling in a small minivan, according to their wives, to do a construction job on an apartment. As this vehicle approached a police checkpoint, the police opened fire and killed everybody inside. Later that afternoon, the police officers went to the homes of these people, and lo and behold, what did they find but some of Giulio Regeni's personal effects?
Just 24 hours later, the Interior Ministry was forced to admit that those men had nothing to do with Regeni's murder.
grazie al lavoro dei nostri investigatori al Cairo, oggi possiamo dire con certezza che la persona che è entrata in quella casa a fare quella perquisizione ha tirato fuori dalla sua tasca i documenti di Giulio. E quindi la domanda è: perché quella persona, che è un ufficiale della National Security, ha i documenti di Giulio?
Regeni was in Egypt researching trade unions, including those of the local street vendors. A year after his death, it emerged that one of the leaders of the street vendors union was a police informant. He had become convinced that Regeni was a spy.
جوليو ازيك عامل ايه؟ اخبارك عامل ايه؟ زعلت.
Lui dà un appuntamento a Giulio poco prima della sua scomparsa, riprende Giulio probabilmente con una microcamera nascosta, immaginiamo, in un bottone.
The union leader wanted Regeni to incriminate himself and pushed for compromising topics like foreign-funded political activism.
مش فاهمني جوليو، هل نستخدم الفلوس دي في مشاريع مثلا باكيات وبتاع ولا نستخدمها في مشاريع الحرية
بس الحاجة السياسية صعبة في الحالة دي.
E Giulio continua a ripetere, gesticolando, perché capisce che le parole non bastano con un interlocutore che è in malafede.
أنا أجنبي في مصر بس باحث وأنا عايز بالنسبة لي يعني أبحث المشروع.
Sono tra l'altro le ultime immagini che la famiglia ha del figlio, ed è particolarmente doloroso che le ultime immagini che questa famiglia ha del proprio figlio sono le immagini del tradimento, perché da lì poi parte tutto.
The union leader reported Regeni to the security services just days before his disappearance. Yet the Egyptian authorities continue to deny any responsibility in his death.
So the Regeni case came at a particularly sensitive moment for relations between Egypt and Italy, because at that very moment the Italian energy company Eni was in the process of developing the largest gas field in the eastern Mediterranean called Zohr in conjunction with Egypt.
La scoperta di Zohr è stato un game changer per Eni, per l'Egitto e per il Mediterraneo. E l'Egitto con questa scoperta ha visto la possibilità, poi già oggi diventata realtà, di passare da un ruolo di paese importatore di energia al ruolo di un paese che finalmente può soddisfare i propri bisogni domestici di energia con un proprio giacimento.
The Zohr gas field is also a major source of profit for Eni, worth an estimated $6.4 billion to the gas giant.
It was in Eni's interest, as well as in Sisi's interest, to achieve a rapid resolution of this case, and so the Zohr project could go ahead.
The political stalemate caused by Regeni's murder came to an end when Italy sent a new ambassador to Cairo.
Si è rinunciato a far sentire la propria voce, si è rinunciato a esercitare la forza diplomatica, a esercitare il negoziato politico fino in fondo.
Penso che se si fanno dei passi avanti, come tutti noi speriamo, anche nell'accertamento della verità, questo è dipeso anche dal fatto di aver tenuto costantemente aperti dei canali di dialogo, anche economico.
Italy did resume diplomatic relations with Egypt about 3 or 4 months before the Zohr project came online, and since then, the project has been a great success by all accounts.
Rapporto economico quale quello che l'Eni è in grado di garantire all'Egitto e l'Egitto è in grado di garantire all'Eni è davvero, e possiamo anche dolercene, è davvero infinitamente più potente della morte di un 28enne italiano.
More than 2 years have passed since Giulio Regeni's murder. In Italy and elsewhere, people are still waiting for the truth. For many Egyptians, what happened to Regeni didn't come as a surprise. Human rights organizations estimate that at least 323 people have died in custody since 2013. 60,000 have been arrested on political charges, and over 15,000 civilians have faced military trials, including 150 children. What has come to be called enforced disappearance is an everyday occurrence.
كتير جدا صحفيين ونشطاء بيختفوا لأيام أو أسابيع وبعدين يظهروا في نيابة أمن الدولة، وما زال الدولة عندها القدرة وعدم حياء إطلاقا إنها تنكر، إنها تقول إن ما فيش إخفاء قسري.
In Berlin, we met Ahmed Said. In 2015, he was working in Germany as a surgeon when he returned to Egypt for a visit.
أنا كان عندي أزمة كبيرة جدا في إن أنا بره مصر. في وقت من الأوقات كان مسيطر عليا إحساس بالذنب وإن أنا هربت وسبت رفاق المعركة هناك، فكنت طول الوقت بحس إن أنا لازم أعمل حاجة.
Ahmed and his friends organized a flash mob in Cairo with banners calling for the release of political prisoners.
في مجموعة من الضباط واقفين شافوني شكلي شعر طويل لابس كوفية، يعني الاستيريوتايبنج بتاع الشباب، شباب الثورة. فالضابط قال للمخبرين والأمناء الشرطة اللي معاه هاتوا لي الواد أبو شعر طويل دوت. أنا كنت طول الفترة اللي بفكر فيه هو هل أنا هظهر دلوقتي وعندي قضية ولا هيتم إخفائي قسريا شوية. قبل ما يسأل أي أسئلة خالص بدأوا حفلة التعذيب والضرب والكهرباء يعني. فأنا قلت له طب أنت ليه؟ يعني أنا أول حاجة قلتها ليه؟ اسأل وأنا هجاوبك، أنت مش محتاج تعمل ده.
Found guilty of protesting without a permit, Ahmed was sent to the infamous Al-Aqrab prison, a maximum security penitentiary reserved for terrorists. A friend of Ahmed's, Taher Mokhtar, is a physician active in the Egyptian medical syndicate.
أنا عارف إن اللحظة السياسية صعبة، وكنت يعني أنا أول ما اتقبض عليه إيدي كان على قلبي مش يومه هيخرج، لا أنا عارف إن واحد زي أحمد بالبروفايل بتاعه بالنسبة للأمن هيقعد شوية. شفته هو في اسم الشرطة في الزيارة اليومية اللي بتبقى لمدة دقيقة، يا دوبك بتسلم بتديله ممكن أكل أو حاجة وبتمشي. سلمت عليه وطمنت عليه سريعا لغاية بعد كده ما اتحكم عليه حكم النهائي السنتين.
Taher is an outspoken critic of the medical neglect of detainees in Egypt.
السجين سواء سياسي أو جنائي ملوش حق في الصحة. أنت مسجون فأنت إنسان مسلوب من كل الحقوق بما فيها حق الصحة. كمان لما أنت بتكون سياسي بيكون في إمعان في التنكيل بيك. أنت سياسي يعني أنت معادي للدولة، فالدولة هتحرمك بشكل أكتر من الحق ده. وفي تعليمات إضافية بالنسبة للسياسيين، ما ينفعش مسجون سياسي يتنقل لمستشفى حتى لو بيموت.
Just 2 months after Ahmed, Taher too was arrested.
دخلوا أوضتي، فتشوا الأوضة، لقوا ورقة بتاعت حملة الإهمال الطبي في السجون جريمة، وفي الآخر عملوا له تهمة حيازة مطبوعات تدعو لقلب نظام الحكم. أنا كنت في زنزانة، أنا مريت على كذا مكان، بس أحد الأماكن اللي كنت فيها كان في حوالي 30 شخص، كان منهم 28 شخص اتعذبوا. اللي هو أنا مش بتكلم على ضرب مرة أو مرتين، لا بتكلم على التعذيب الممنهج. طبعا قبل كده بيلعبوا شويه على النفسيه، ان هو طول الوقت عمال، انت طبعا متغمي مش شايف اي حاجه، مش عارف ايه اللي بيحصل حواليك. طول الوقت بيستخدموا ان هم اشياء معدنيه يقعدوا يخبطوها في بعض، ان هو عشان يوترك. هم كانوا حطوا في ايديا الميتالز، الحاجات الحديد اللي هي بتاعت اللي هيوصلوا عليها الكهرباء. وفي حاجه كده بيعملوها بين الصوابع بحيث ان هو تبقى انت يعني متقدرش تحرك صبعك، وان هو ممكن صبعك يتكسر، يعني مثلا يحطوا حاجه كده ويضغطوا على الصابع. ممكن مسجون يتعلق من ايده ورجله في سلسلة نازلة من السقف لمدة 2 أو 3. في وسيلة كمان مشهورة بشعة جدا، بيجيبوا طاولة معدن، ترابيزة حديد، ويحطوا عليها مية ويكتفوا المسجون بجنزير ويكهربوه بالترابيزة.
Thanks to an international campaign highlighting his case, Ahmed Saeed was released after a year in prison. He now lives in Germany.
طبعا نفسي ان انا ارجع مصر، بس طبعا انا ما اقدرش ارجع، يعني لحد دلوقتي ما اقدرش ارجع. انا عندي طفل عندي مودي عنده 12 سنة موجود في مصر، وابويا وامي واختي موجودين في مصر.
Taher Mokhtar was freed after 7 months and now lives in France.
انا بس سبت مصر برجلي بمكاني عشان السجن مفيش نشاط ممكن يتعمل في السجن. بالنسبه لي النشاط اللي اتعمل من المنفى اكتر من نشاط السجن، وده كان السبب الاساسي لاختيار النفي عن السجن، لان ممكن اقدر اخدم القضيه بتاعتي من مكان مختلف، قضيه الثوره يعني القضيه بتاعتنا، ومكمل نشاط منها.
واحد كان معايا في الزنزانه يعني قال لي ما تنساناش، اوعى تنسانا. فالجمله دي طبعا معايا طول الوقت، فالجمله دي معايا، فمش معنى ان انا بره ان انا ماليش علاقه باللي بيحصل هناك، يعني انا طول الوقت عايش هناك.
Documenting human rights violations has become very dangerous in Egypt. Since 2013, over 500 online news outlets have been shut down. 8 journalists have been killed while covering demonstrations, and 33 journalists and bloggers are currently detained, some of them facing a possible death penalty.
لو حد أساء للجيش أو الشرطة ده في الآخر بيسيء لكل المصريين، وهنا ما بقتش حرية رأي بقى. لا دي مش حرية رأي. الإساءة دي تساوي دلوقتي بالنسبة لي خيانة عظمى. تساوي ايه يا فندم؟ خيانة عظمى.
بالنسبة لي كصحفية اشتغلت في الصحافة وقت حكم حسني مبارك. أعتقد إنه دي أكتر لحظة معقدة وصعبة في الممارسة الصحفية.
Despite an unprecedented crackdown on journalists, some continue their mission. Lina Atala is among the founders of one of the few remaining independent voices in Egypt, the news website called Mada Masr.
توثيق التجاوزات اللي هو اختيار مكمل معانا لغاية النهاردة في 2018 كان نتيجته هو انه تم حجب الموقع في مايو 2017.
Journalists date the current media climate back to the moment when Abdel Fattah el-Sisi became the strongman of Egypt.
I don't know who it was, but someone was definitely entering my flat because they were leaving cigarette butts in my toilet bowl. I don't know who that is, but it was happening at a time when, you know, we really felt like what we were writing was being followed very closely.
Perhaps the most famous case is the arrest of 3 Al Jazeera journalists in 2013. The men were freed after over a year in prison. Today, Al Jazeera has no correspondence in Egypt, and the Qatari network is still banned from broadcasting in the country.
As a foreign correspondent with a Western passport, you do have many privileges that an Egyptian journalist would not have, because I knew that ultimately if anything were to go wrong, I have my government behind me, and the worst that could have really happened to me would be being asked to leave the country.
Beltrou had been based in Egypt for 7 years. In early 2018, on her way home from a routine assignment, she was pulled over by an unmarked vehicle.
And 6 plainclothes police officers got out of the car and basically ushered me off to a police station. And it transpired that there was an informer in the cafe that I had been doing an interview in. And he had misinterpreted what I was saying and thought, or at least accused me of defaming the state.
The Times reporter was held at the police station and questioned for more than 7 hours.
I was very confused. At this point, I had no idea because I had no access to the outside world, and they wouldn't let me see a lawyer or my consular official. So I had no idea if anyone had raised the alarm. I didn't know if anyone knew I was missing.
In the end, she was taken to the airport.
There weren't charges against me, but they were told that if I didn't get on a plane, I would face military trial. And military trial in Egypt is a very serious part of the judicial process. It is usually a military judge. It's usually quite short in terms of the number of sessions, usually maybe only one. And the sentences handed out are very long, and sometimes even the death penalty. So I was deported in the clothes that I was wearing when I got arrested that morning.
Egypt looked very different in 2011. Nobody could anticipate that in just 2 years, the country would once again be a military dictatorship.
I thought it was a dream, and I saw it right on my small iPhone screen happening. It was a reality. People took to the streets peacefully to demand democracy, to demand that the ceiling that has always been placed on their hopes and dreams could finally be uplifted. And there was no way I was going to not be a part of that.
An American-Egyptian citizen, Mohammed Sultan, got on a plane to Cairo and quickly found himself at the front lines of the revolt. At its peak, millions of people gathered outside the presidential palace.
We were at the front lines. We had told the army officers on the other side of the barbed wire that once we're done praying, we're going to get through and we're going to storm the presidential palace. If they were to fire on us, we would die, but there's 50,000 others behind us. I was crying my eyes out. I thought that for sure they were going to fire on us and we were going to die. So I was saying my last prayers literally. And I was also praying that this injustice would be lifted. This dictator that's right there would just leave. And in that same moment, the army turns on the speakers of the announcement. Literally within moments, those tears of fear, those tears of, just all of this injustice, this like readying yourself to die. And then they turn into happy tears. This man that's been there for 30 years, that he is leaving. We did this.
A former Air Force commander, Hosni Mubarak, had been the face of Egypt's military dictatorship since 1981. Now he was gone, but his regime remained largely intact. When the Islamist Mohamed Morsi became Egypt's first democratically elected president, the military worked to undermine him from day one. But Morsi also proved incapable of building a national consensus. With the economy in freefall, he quickly alienated many Egyptians by concentrating power in his own hands.
And many Egyptians who had supported the ouster of President Mubarak, suddenly turned around and said, hold on, this is also not what we want. And suddenly you had a brand new type of conflict inside Egyptian society.
Alarmed about Egypt's renewed instability, officials in the Obama administration advised Morsi to try to meet the opposition halfway.
We were encouraging him to try to engage with the opposition, to try to show some effort to address their concerns and to pledge to govern in a different manner moving forward. Morsi's response was to essentially dismiss us.
When millions of protesters poured into the streets on the first anniversary of his election, the Egyptian military exploited the situation to remove Morsi. Sisi, whom Morsi had put in charge of the army, gave him 48 hours to come up with a political solution.
Both Morsi himself and his senior advisors did not see this coming. They knew there was opposition, they knew that there was discontent, but they didn't think the Egyptian military would actually move against them in the final analysis.
On July 3rd, 2013, Sisi had Morsi arrested. The new military leadership suspended the constitution and arrested 300 Muslim Brotherhood officials. The initial attack on Morsi supporters soon expanded to include all political opposition to the regime. Egypt occupies a position of strategic importance for the West in the Middle East. It's Israel's next-door neighbor and controls access to the Suez Canal.
Right from the beginning, from when the United States became involved in the Middle East post-World War II, American officials decided it would be much better to have Egypt on your side rather than working against you.
It's been a very simple bargain. The United States has provided Egypt with a large amount of military aid every year, and in return Egypt has kept the peace with Israel, has provided access to the Suez Canal for American warships, and has provided America with really a very strong pillar in the middle of a very volatile region.
When Sisi took power, relations began to crack.
Initially, when Sisi carried out the coup in July of 2013, I think the Obama administration officials were unhappy about it, but they felt there was nothing they could do to stop it.
There was a general willingness to try to work with the new regime out of the interest in preserving the bilateral relationship. So they were willing to give the new military regime an opportunity to prove themselves.
Sisi soon showed the Obama administration what he was capable of. In the weeks after the military takeover, Morsi supporters had occupied two major thoroughfares in Cairo, the Al-Nada Square and the road in front of the Rabba al-Dawiyya Mosque. In August, the military cleared the camps with an unprecedented show of force. Mohammed Sultan was there. His father, a deputy minister in the short-lived Muslim Brotherhood government, was among those addressing the protesters from the stage.
It wasn't about Morsi, it wasn't about legitimacy or Sharia or any of those things. I wanted democracy for the country. I went to the main entrance, came out and just saw how much they had advanced with the bulldozers and people just shooting people point blank, snipers, just shooting at the stage. My dad's sitting under a table and they're shooting at the stage. Here I was taking pictures, coming back, putting my phone on, waiting for signal to come, and then tweeting, taking phone calls from CNN, Al Jazeera, this and that. I literally take it off speaker and I going like this so I can take off my charger, and literally as soon as I do that, the bullet flies right past, like literally whizzes right past my ear. I didn't even have time to think, and I said, what the f-? And I get hit from behind. There's this distinct smell of tear gas, blood, and bullets. You can almost taste it. And literally bodies falling. Anywhere you look, bodies upon bodies. We're in there until about 5 p.m. where the first safe exit was allowed after 11 hours of nonstop shooting. Remember, they wouldn't let us take the injured. If you were injured, I was injured, but if you were injured and you couldn't walk on your own 2 feet, you couldn't get out.
Human Rights Watch documented 817 victims, but the number may be as high as 1,000.
The United States strongly condemns the steps that have been taken by Egypt's interim government and security forces. We deplore violence against civilians.
President Obama canceled a joint military exercise and froze part of the $1.3 billion in military aid Egypt receives from the U.S. every year. But Sisi continued his crackdown undeterred.
10 days later, they show up to look for my dad. He's not there, so they pick me up, and I remember the officer that came to arrest my dad. He looked at the passport, my American passport, and he said, "Do you think this is going to help you?" And you know, he said, which was really interesting. You know, he said, "Don't worry, boys. It's 2-3 years, you'll be out." He wasn't lying. Prison, you get this much space. Say a hand and a fist. You've got to sleep. You've got to take shifts sleeping with people. There's one bathroom for 50+ men. Of course, you're forced to strip naked, except your underwear. You're beaten. Your head's shaved. It's total humiliation. I decided to go on a hunger strike because it was the only means of resistance. No hard foods for 489 days. They would bring my dad to the next ward, beat him, let me hear his screams, and come tell me, "Listen, this is what's happening to your dad. You know, we can end this. Just break your strike." There's no low for these guys. There's no low. Spent 22 months in prison, got sentenced to life in the last 2.5 months for journalism charges. After my campaign had reached its peak, reached all the way to the President of the United States of America, they stormed my room, put me on my wheelchair, grabbed my bag, went and talked to the warden. They blindfolded me, put me in a car, transport car, and took me to open the door and wheeled me out and took off the blindfold, and I was in the airport.
In May 2015, with Sultan still in prison, the Obama administration formally reported to the U.S. Congress that arbitrary and unlawful killings were taking place in Egypt. Yet the same document officially resumed military aid to Egypt. Sisi remained the man to be reckoned with in Cairo.
You're hearing concerns from the Saudis, from the Emiratis, from the Israelis that the freeze and assistance to Egypt was counterproductive, that they weren't pleased with it. There was a desire to, I think, address some of their concerns.
Saudi Arabia and the Emirates invested in Sisi from quite early on.
Without the very extensive economic support that the Egyptian military got from the Gulf states, for example, in 2013, I don't know whether they would have carried out the coup or they would have been able to make a go of it.
Sisi was able to say that there's this threat from ISIS, you want to defeat it, we're your partner, give us the tools and we'll take care of this for you. And he would make the argument that Egypt is too big to fail. If Egypt does collapse, if the Islamists run amok or the economy goes down, this is going to have disastrous consequences for the region and for Europe.
The European Union has tried to strike a balance between legitimate security concerns and respect for human rights. But many member states have adopted a different policy, literally business as usual.
Well, unfortunately, we still have a very weak common ground in Europe when it comes to how to deal with Egypt.
The Dutch EU parliamentary member Marietje Schaake was the initiator of a resolution that condemned human rights violations in Egypt. However, she doubts that leaders of the influential member states will follow the lead.
We very much pointed out that human rights repression, violations, executions, torture, censorship, closing of NGOs is not acceptable. And you won't hear such strong words from, let's say, Berlin or Paris or London very much.
Schaake pushed for 3 years to get the resolution through the European Parliament. Besides denouncing the high number of death penalties, executions, and the lack of fair trials, there was another point she was stressing.
I think we've learned some very important lessons in 2011, 2012, when we found that EU-made systems were actually used to track down activists in Egypt. And so ever since, we've been pushing in the European Parliament, and I've been leading the efforts on the export controls of surveillance systems to make sure that human rights are a criterion to measure before an export license is granted. And despite this statement of principle, we see that in practice, such export controls are not really lived up to. In fact, there are serious questions whether it may be the case that Giulio Regeni, who was brutally murdered, may have been tracked and traced with Italian-made systems and software.
After the Rabba massacre in 2013, EU member states agreed to suspend exports to Egypt of any equipment that might be used for internal repression. Yet 12 out of 28 EU member states ignored the suspension. Since 2014, Italy has exported weapons to Egypt worth some 40 million euros, mostly guns and rifles. Germany has made deals for over 1 billion euros, including light arms and armored vehicles. And France has topped all the rest with over 6 billion euros in sales, including combat vehicles like those reportedly used in the Rabba massacre.
La France est devenue le principal fournisseur d'armes de l'Égypte. Le fait que les Rafales, les premiers Rafales qu'on essayait de vendre depuis 20 ans, on les a vendus à l'Égypte, c'était un élément important. Et c'est sûr aujourd'hui que c'est un des arguments qui pèsent dans nos relations bilatérales.
Vous savez, les Français sont encore plus que la plupart des Occidentaux très favorables à la démocratie. Surtout quand ça donne les résultats qu'elle espère. Parce que quand ça donne pas les résultats qu'elle espère, ça nous embête un peu. Quand la démocratie accouche des islamistes, ça nous plaît pas trop. L'approche du problème par le président Macron, elle est beaucoup plus pragmatique. Il existe un état de fait, on n'y peut rien, essayons de vivre en bonne intelligence et si possible de faire des affaires.
Je crois à la souveraineté des États. Et donc, de la même façon que je n'accepte qu'aucun autre dirigeant me donne des leçons sur la manière de gouverner mon pays, je n'en donne pas aux autres.
Ce n'est plus notre priorité, la démocratie. Ça n'a jamais été vraiment. Avec en plus un argument supplémentaire, c'est de dire, regardez ce que ça a donné la démocratie. Il y a la guerre civile en Syrie, il y a la guerre civile en Irak, il y a le Yémen, il y a la Libye. Ce n'est plus à l'ordre du jour. Et ce qui est important, c'est nos relations bilatérales, c'est la stabilité de l'Égypte, c'est la guerre contre le terrorisme.
Terrorism has been on the rise in Egypt, especially in the Sinai Peninsula. The northeast corner of this remote region has become for European leaders one of the Middle East's hottest front lines against jihadist groups.
The Sisi government appears to be struggling to contain this threat of Islamic State militants who are based in the Sinai. And of course now with the effective collapse of Islamic State power in Iraq and Syria, there are indications that at least some of those fighters are now coming from those areas into the Sinai.
But it's hard to know what's really happening in northeast Sinai, as the independent media hasn't been allowed into the area for years.
احنا ازاي هنتكلم على سينا من هنا ورايح؟ ازاي هنحكي القصه؟ خصوصا انه الروايه الاساسيه المطروحه لنا عن سينا النهارده يا اما بتقدمها الروايه الرسميه للدوله عن طريق المتحدث العسكري يا اما بتقدمها منصات الدوله الاسلاميه اللي هي برضه بتعطي سرديات تنقصها الدقه.
Unconfirmed leaks from the area deliver horrific pictures of the Egyptian army's brutal crackdown, amid increasing concerns for the civilian population. Yet for all the force deployed, the Egyptian army has yet to regain control of the area, while terrorist attacks appear to be spreading throughout Egypt.
The Islamic State has expanded its operations in Egypt, both within the Sinai by carrying out bombings, for instance, against a large mosque, in which over 300 people were killed, and also by carrying out attacks on minority Christians across the rest of the country in a number of suicide bombings last year.
President Sisi recently announced the final offensive.
أنت مسؤول خلال 3 شهور عن استعادة الأمن والاستقرار في سيناء. خلال 3 شهور تستعيد مصر بفضل الله سبحانه وتعالى وتستخدم كل القوة الغاشمة.
His message is that he is the only thing that is standing between Egypt becoming another province of an Islamic caliphate and stability and security and safety.
In 2016, a truck deliberately drove through a Christmas market in Berlin. After Paris and London, terrorism had struck once again inside a European capital. Chancellor Angela Merkel turned to Egypt as a partner to improve security and counter terrorism, signing a cooperation deal in 2017.
Ein ganz wichtiger Faktor zum Beispiel ist, dass man beim Sicherheitsabkommen festgelegt hatte, dass man Lehrgänge macht und der Polizei und den Sicherheitskräften in Ägypten zeigt, wie man gegen Cyberkriminalität vorgeht sozusagen, also Terrorismus über Internet. Bis dann die Bundesregierung feststellte, dass das aber in Ägypten einen ganz anderen Ton hat, denn in Ägypten gilt man als Terrorist, wenn man eine oppositionelle Meinung hat.
Germany also looked to Sisi to stem the tide of migrants and refugees, leaving the Middle East and Africa for Europe. Chancellor Merkel offered Sisi a $500 million aid package to essentially close off the Egyptian route to Europe.
Hier geht es vor allen Dingen darum, die technische Ausrüstung zu verbessern, sowohl was die Landgrenze in Ägypten anbelangt, als auch was die seeseitigen Grenzen anbelangt, die auch unvorstellbar aus deutscher geografischer Kenntnis lang und intensiv sind.
Wenn das Land zerfiele oder die Militärdiktatur, die es dort gibt, das spreche ich offen an, in Gefahr wäre und einige Millionen Ägypter das Land verließen, dann wäre es dramatisch.
Critics warn that Egypt may use the migration issue to exert pressure on Europe.
Hier ist ein Hebel. Auf der einen Seite kann Ägypten drohen, Flüchtlinge nach Europa zu lassen, aber bisher ist erkennbar das nicht der Fall, sondern Ägypten hat ein Interesse an der Kooperation. Ich habe oft den Eindruck, dass Ägypten das Ganze wie ein Basar versteht, also jetzt nicht nachhaltig eine bestimmte Strategie verfolgt, sondern schaut, was für Ägypten selbst attraktiv ist, um dann im Gegenzug die eine oder andere Gegenleistung zu bringen. Aber wir Europäer dürfen da nicht blauäugig sein, wir müssen da knallhart verhandeln.
Today, Germany and Egypt have a good working relationship, but it was not always so. Initial misgivings about Sisi's military regime faded away in light of a mega project that Egypt granted to the German Siemens company. A gigantic investment to build the largest gas-fired power plant in the world.
Als Siemens diesen Auftrag bekam, hatte der eine Dimension von 8 Milliarden Euro. Das ist eine ungewöhnliche Dimension, war für Siemens der größte Auftrag in der gesamten Firmengeschichte. Zu dem Zeitpunkt, als Herr Sisi sich bei Frau Merkel über den roten Teppich hat geleiten lassen, fand in Ägypten gerade der Prozess gegen den ersten gewählten Präsidenten Mursi statt. Zu jenem Zeitpunkt wurde er gerade zum Tode verurteilt. Das ist etwas, was wir in Deutschland eigentlich nicht befürworten.
هي الديمقراطية بتقول إيه؟ إن أنتم ليكم وجهة نظر نحن نحترمها وإحنا لينا وجهة نظر أنتم تحترموها أيضا وإلا يبقى وجهة نظر واحدة.
Dass zu just so einem Zeitpunkt der Präsident, der Mursi mit einem Putsch aus dem Amt geschafft hat, im Bundeskanzleramt empfangen wird, zeigt die Dimension, was die Politik glaubte, wie wichtig es ist, dass Siemens diesen großen Auftrag bekommt.
Herzlichen Dank.
The Berlin press conference of the two leaders turned symbolic of Egyptian reality. The protest of an Egyptian medical student was drowned out by Sisi's entourage, chanting his slogan.
It is a great honor to have with us today President el-Sisi of Egypt.
With Donald Trump's election, Sisi could look forward to friendlier relations, also in Washington.
We appreciate everything that you've done, and I know you appreciate everything that we've done.
It's no secret that Trump has an affinity for dictatorial figures. He's explicitly embraced Sisi in public. He's called him a strong leader, as someone who's really getting stuff done.
At the same time, Russia and Egypt have been growing closer. Vladimir Putin and Sisi have visited each other several times, with financial deals and military cooperation on the agenda.
What we're likely to see is that Egypt is going to simultaneously pursue relations with both Moscow and Washington in order to ensure that they're not in a position of subservience to either global power.
While the Egyptian government is looking for partners who don't ask uncomfortable questions, it remains to be seen how Washington's long-term priorities evolve.
I think for President Trump, he's perfectly comfortable returning to the way things used to be, where the U.S. was perfectly happy to trade off democracy for security, and that working with a dictator is completely consistent with his worldview.
Foreign policy is by definition the pursuit of a country's interests. As Sisi enters his 5th year in power, the question is it really in the West's interest to continue supporting him unconditionally?
On the security aspect, I think it's fairly clear he hasn't delivered. He hasn't defeated ISIS, which the ISIS affiliate within the Sinai. Most estimates place that group at between 800 and 1,200 people. That's not a very large entity. Yet, over the course of 5 years, he's been incapable of fully finishing off this group.
According to those who've seen Egyptian prisons from the inside, repression, torture, and prison conditions, the conflation of all dissent with terrorism may prove to be counterproductive in the long run.
أنا شفت ده بعيني في السجون، إزاي الناس بتتحول من ناس مؤمنة بالسلام والتغيير السلمي اللي ناس إن هم شايفين إن الحاجة الوحيدة اللي ممكن تغيرها السلاح.
Those same prisons in the 60s, 70s, and 80s produced Islamic Jihad movements that gave birth to Al-Qaeda that then grandfathered ISIS. I don't even want to begin to imagine what we're going to have in 5, 10, 15 years.
Some in Europe have become complacent. They have accepted that this is the Egypt we'll have to deal with. Now, I think it's a mistake. I think it will come back as a boomerang. There's an enormous amount of young people in Egypt that don't have enough perspectives. They don't have enough perspectives for a prosperous life, a life they can shape the way they would like. They are the future, and they should be at the heart and at the core of what the EU does.